Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our discussion will cover some practical ideas about how your church can identify and prepare new mission workers. Our guest is Paul Seger, who grew up in Nigeria as an MK, a missionary kid. Paul and his wife Joan, who also grew up on the mission field in Africa, now live in Atlanta, Georgia. They began their ministry with Biblical Ministries Worldwide in 1975 and have served as church planters, including discipleship roles and leadership training. And Paul now serves as the General Director of Biblical Ministries Worldwide, and he's committed to helping local churches mobilize and support workers around the world. Paul, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. What a joy to be with you.
I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I've had a chance to engage with Paul's book, which is entitled Senders: How Your Church Can Identify, Train, and Deploy Missionaries. Paul, as I read this, there were a number of ideas. I just felt an easy resonance with your perspective. And so I'm looking forward to unpacking it together with you. Just before we get to the book, please tell us just a little bit about your role at Biblical Ministries Worldwide.
I'm the CEO of this organization. We just help missionaries to get to the field from North America. So my role is to provide the overall vision and direction and leadership for this family of missionaries.
And are they involved in a particular type of ministry, Paul, or a variety?
Everything we do revolves around establishing local churches. So that could include starting from scratch or enhancing existing churches. So it's all local church oriented.
Well, as I opened your book right at the beginning, you actually began by talking not about the church, but about a company called Coca-Cola. And you expressed just a little bit of frustration, I'll say, if I could describe it that way. You said, they beat us. They did it first. What do you mean, and what did Coke do that the church hasn't done?
Well, the headquarters for Coca-Cola is here where I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we're fully aware of their constant presence here. But they had set a vision to have everybody in the world taste a Coke. And to a large part, they've succeeded. You can go almost anywhere. You can be canoeing down the Amazon River and there'll be a old Coke can floating by. So they got there first with their sugar water. And that's just, it galls me that a secular company actually got out there and reached everyone before we did.
Mm-hmm. That's a striking illustration. Of course, there's still many, many people groups around the world that we consider to be unreached, do not have an opportunity to hear and understand the gospel in a culturally appropriate way. And I hope that our discussion will lead toward addressing that or helping to address that as well. This book that you've written, Paul, again, the title is Senders: How Your Church Can Identify, Train, and Deploy Missionaries. Well, let's go to the book. You refer to local churches as, quote, ground zero. Tell us what you mean by ground zero.
Well, this term was coined way back in World War II. It was called the Manhattan Project, that they created the first atomic bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, the spot on the planet where they dropped that was labeled then Ground Zero. And from that point, we all have seen the pictures of how the waves of heat and devastation rolled out from that one spot. So I use that sort of as an illustration or a visual of what the local church could and should be. That from the local church, there needs to be waves of reaching outwards. And that is obviously the core of the Great Commission. And so the local church, I'm arguing, is ground zero, whereas maybe we've had a tendency, some of us in parachurch organizations, to take over and view ourselves as that. The point I'm trying to make is the local church is really the way God designed things to happen.
Mm-hmm. Great point, and an important one for those of us also who serve in mission agencies. The way we sometimes describe it here is that this organization, an agency, exists to serve the church and not the other way around, so that when we approach and speak to a pastor or leadership team or a missions committee, that we approach in a humble servant way as opposed to just bringing our agenda. same principle that the church is the primary stakeholder in the Great Commission.
I may have mentioned in the book as well that, if every mission agency, Bible college, and seminary went out of existence, we would still need to do the Great Commission. So
Exactly.
it's the local church that has that responsibility and that needs to carry that.
Well, you go on to say that missionaries should be considered as draftees and not volunteers. How do you see a difference between a draftee and a volunteer?
We take this idea from Acts chapter 13, where Paul and Barnabas were sent out from the church there in Antioch. And if you read the text, it says that the Spirit of God was communicating to somebody, but it wasn't Paul and Barnabas. It was somebody in the church or maybe the leadership team, because it says, set apart Paul and Barnabas for the work unto which I've called them. We want to volunteer. We want to be the one hearing from the Spirit of God. Whereas it seemed like in that early church, the Spirit was communicating to the other members of that body. When you sort of sync that with some of the other stories that we see in Scripture, such as Jesus not asking for volunteers, he picked people, such as all of the prophets, judges, well, even Moses, they were all drafted. God wasn't looking for volunteers. He was putting their finger on someone. I use that simply as a model for saying, instead of waiting for us to maybe have a teenager raise their hand and say, okay, I'll volunteer to be a missionary, that maybe the church could be more proactive in drafting some people, which sounds counterintuitive to the way we tend to think, but I think there is a biblical precedent for that.
Yeah. Do you think either can be true, Paul? It's possible that someone feels a personal call, can I say first, and then brings that to the church?
I think it needs to be a combination, which one is first, the chicken or the egg. I'm not really sure, but there's both parts of this, because someone may draft me, but if I'm not willing to go, I'm not going. On the flip side, I may be saying I'm ready to go, but the congregation or the church I'm with says, you know what, you're really not quite ready to go. So I think there needs to be the combination of both.
Well, this is very relevant. Sometimes we'll engage, for example, with students. And if an agency's first contact is with a student while they're studying in university or college, this is where we've seen it really important to connect with a local church, because we want the church to be involved in that discernment process very, very early on. Our mobilizers are instructed to ask in the first conversation they have, who at your church knows we're having this conversation? You allude to that in your book as well, that the mission agency that you serve with actually won't give out an application until the church has been involved in the process.
Yeah, exactly right. What happens so often is we send reps to college campuses or seminaries, and they sign up and join the agency, decide where they're going to go. And then they go back to the church and say, hey, would you mind giving me some money? And we're saying that's really the wrong way around. We need to start with the local church. And the local church knows that individual. A missions rep can't get to know someone in a 1-hour conversation on a college campus.
Yeah, very well spoken, and something that we should take great care with. I have an experience not so very long ago. Within the last year, I met with a young man and met with him in a coffee shop, and we were talking about the potential of his going. And along the way, I asked him, who at your church knows that we're having this conversation? You're meeting with an agency to explore ideas. And he sort of thought for a moment, and he said, I'm not sure anybody other than my family, really. And I said, well, we need to connect with your pastor, and you need to advance this conversation with him, which he did. And that led to a wonderful interaction, a 3-way conversation with the church where they take primacy, and we're alongside to help send this young man out now. But it's their vision for the ministry, and they've embraced it. And it's far more than just what I call an ATM, just showing up for funds from a church.
Great way to put that, yeah.
You describe a couple of different kinds of churches. I enjoyed your illustration, actually. When we're recording this, it's late September, and the harvest is beginning to come in. You talk about tomatoes and the difference between having a homegrown tomato and how good that is when we take it out of our own garden, how that feels different than maybe something that's been shipped in from some other place. Talk to us just a little bit about that illustration and how that relates to churches.
Well, I'm not a very successful gardener, but my friends that do, I love to go sit in their garden and literally eat the tomato off the vine. It just tastes so much better than when you buy it from a grocery store. And what I was trying to illustrate through that idea was this. I recently read of a large denomination here in America that is really known for sending out missionaries, and they support missionaries to a big amount. But I was a bit chagrined to see that they said 91% of churches in their denomination had never sent out their own missionary. They all support missionaries, but they don't send their own out. And they haven't had somebody from their congregation go to the mission field. And I would concur, most of the churches, every church I go to supports missionaries financially, but the vast majority of them have never produced their own. Well, it's wonderful to support a missionary from another church, but I tell you what, there's nothing like having a missionary from your own church go into the field. There's just a special relationship. It's just like homegrown tomatoes. I mean, you just can't beat it. There's a great synergy and dynamic and excitement that comes from actually seeing one of your own go to the mission field.
Mm-hmm. So Paul helpfully in the book outlines two types of churches he's just mentioned. One is a supporting church, and we're very thankful for those that send workers out. They help to send workers out by supporting them in various ways. It could include financial support for a missionary, but they're sent from another church, really. And then a sending church who is focused or includes growing and training and sending out their own people to involve. It's a great question for our missions committees to ask. Are we a supporting church, which is good, or might we also be a sending church and send some of our own?
We definitely need both of those. We don't want to stop either one of them.
Yeah, well spoken. Well, as we begin in our churches to perhaps more deliberately identify workers, Paul, maybe we have a growing sense that we should not only be a supporting church, but also a sending church. What are some of the characteristics in people that we should begin looking for?
I think foundational to really any kind of ministry that anybody does, the primary qualifier has to be the subject of faithfulness. Paul made that evidently clear in passages like 1 Corinthians 4. It's required among stewards that a man be found faithful. Paul told Timothy if he's going to train people, he needs to find faithful men who would be able to train others also. Paul spoke of himself and said, God counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry. So faithfulness is really, that's where the starting blocks are. If a person isn't faithful, there's really no need proceeding beyond that. So that, to me, is really the starting point. If a person is faithful, then we start moving in this direction. If they're not faithful here, they're not going to be faithful there.
Are there other qualities? I guess I'd put faithfulness into this category we would call character. Are there other points of character that you think would be next steps after faithfulness?
Well, most certainly, of course, anybody in leadership has to meet the qualifications of 1 Timothy chapter 3, whether it be deacon or elder, however you define that. So all of those are character qualities that need to be true of a person that's going to be a missionary. And we would view a missionary as being a leader in the church, whether you're technically part on the official board or not is not so much the issue, but you certainly have to have those character qualities in order to qualify to be a missionary.
Sure. And then are there skill sets in addition to character? If we take the foundation, as you said, being Christ-like character, growing in Christ-like character, what are some of the skill sets that generally should be observed in someone who might serve as a mission worker?
We've identified 16 different skill sets that we think a missionary needs to have in today's world. Maybe this wasn't always the case, but certainly in today's world, if you're going to be involved in establishing churches, leadership development, discipleship, that kind of thing. So those are listed in the book, and they're all related to things like the ability to disciple someone, the ability to communicate, the ability to manage your time. People skills, for instance, that's something that is kind of hard to have a class on, but most of us, it's a make or break thing with our leadership as to whether we can relate well with people. And you may know a lot of stuff and you may be good at speaking, but if you don't have the people skills, you're going to sort of leave yourself stranded. And then there are just practical things in today's world. I need to have computer skills. I need to think strategically. I need to be able to write. I need to be able to function within a team. Then there's exegetical skills so that I know how to exegete the scripture and how I can counsel people. I need language aptitude. There's just a whole long list of things that I really need to have by way of my own personal skills. But character obviously is at the beginning, but then these skills need to be developed. And what a wonderful place to develop them in the local church.
Well, that's what was coming to mind too. It's true that a mission agency will apply specific training and perhaps some very specific readying to serve in a certain type of ministry or in a certain place. And also we could say Bible schools and other training programs can provide that. But I think we'll agree that the local church is the best laboratory in which to be testing and growing in these things prior to serving in mission service.
That's for sure. And that's the beauty of the local church, that the local church has it's kind of a laboratory or a educational entity that we can develop and train people in these skills. And before sending them overseas, we can establish whether or not they have those abilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, in just a moment, we're going to talk about some ways that church leaders can train up potential missionaries within the church. Before we get to that, we're going to take a quick break and tell you about an organization that can help you and your church participate in global missions.
OMF is a global fellowship of Christians with a heart for East Asia. Founded by James Hudson Taylor over 151 years ago, we're still pioneering, partnering, and praying, and persevering in difficult places. Learn how you can join God's work among East Asians at omf.ca. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back talking with Paul Seger about how the local church can identify, train, and deploy mission workers. Paul, we were talking about some of the characteristics to look for in potential mission workers, but you've mentioned in your book it's not only important for church leaders to be able to identify the characteristics of those people, but also to have a proactive and strategic plan for training leaders who could potentially become mission workers. And you talk about the idea of farm teams. Let's just talk about farm teams. What do you mean by the farm team, first of all?
Well, since I grew up in Africa, I'm sort of intrigued by American sports. And so I may not have this exactly right, but my understanding is that professional baseball teams have farm teams. And that is basically a way for them to keep in reserve and to develop players so that when somebody is either injured or they need to replace them, they have a good place to go to find new players so they can keep going in the season. And so a farm team is just that. So the analogy that I was making in a local church is we need to have systems for developing our future players, our future missionaries, our future leaders. And if we don't have that system in place, when we lose a leader, we're sort of standing there without a resource.
Mm-hmm. The analogy fits. And just for my friends who are up here in Canada, we have the same thing for hockey teams. The idea that it's a place where players can grow their skills. They can be coached. They can be further prepared to play in the big leagues, if you will. And the analogy breaks down at some point, but it's very helpful, I think. So what are some of the steps that pastors or church leaders can take to start developing a farm team for global missions?
Well, I think you have to strategize from the nursery on up what you can do to help a person be what they ought to be, do what they ought to do, and know what they ought to know. Or some people have put it this way, head, hands, and heart. Those are the three big components or building blocks to any farm team training system. There's certain things you have to know, there's certain things you have to be able to do, and there's certain things that you have to be. In other words, character that we were talking about just a few moments earlier.
Okay. The head being what you know, knowledge. There are certain facts, theological truths, facts about a local culture to know. Hands would be like ministry skills, you mean, and whatever's appropriate in that context?
Correct. In other words, believe it or not, some people come and want to join our organization, and we start asking them, have you ever evangelized? And they would say no. Well, that's both a heart issue, but also a skill set. If you've never done it here, the chances are when you get off that airplane on the other side, you're not going to do it there either. So that's something that the local church can train in. You can train people in the local church how to disciple a new believer. And all the skill sets, whatever your ministry is going to be, all those can be developed and should be developed here rather than getting off the airplane on the other side and assuming that you can just do them.
Right. We can't assume that for sure. In some cases, we've had to postpone the deployment of workers to help them prepare further, just to say it generally. We don't want to be holding people back. We're not in the business of keeping them from the mission field, we hope. We want them to be well ready. And our field leadership has appreciated that, although it's led to some delays at some points because we want to make sure that they're ready to go. So the three that you have identified there, the head, what we need to know, the hands, what we should be able to do, and then the heart, that's back to attitude and character. Is that right?
Right, because ultimately it doesn't matter how well you can do something or how much you know. If we are not living godly lives, we're disqualified. You don't have to have good character to maybe do some of the other jobs in the world, but if you're going to be in ministry, it's demanded that we have godly character.
Well, I wonder if you can give us an example of where you've seen this really working well, Paul. A local church that you've seen really do a good job of this. How do they go about it, and what did it look like in that context?
Well, maybe I could just speak from personal experience from the mission field because we did this. We were generating and developing leaders who now, many of them are missionaries or pastors of churches. And we chose to do this all within the local church. We can outsource to Bible colleges, seminaries, and we can outsource some of the training, but ultimately I think the local church has to retain the responsibility for it. And so, for instance, I would find a man who has already demonstrated himself to be faithful. So we developed the curriculum, though you don't need to develop your own. There's so much online curriculum available, so many ways to import academic training into your local church. Not everybody has to go off to a campus somewhere. You could import that and do a lot of your theological training in-house, which we did. So we used a non-formal church-based training program in which we would meet with them going through what you would consider a typical Bible college or seminary academic education. I would spend time with this individual every week doing ministry together. So it might be working in the youth program, might be going out evangelizing, could be discipling, preparing a message, all the things that you need to train. You actually have to do that with them. And they watch you do it, you watch them do it, you mentor them and coach them in developing the skills that they need. And then I would also meet another time during the week to just talk about how their walk with God is going, what their devotional life is like, what they're praying about, what sins are they struggling with, how's their family doing. And so it's really not complicated. It's, however, a commitment to say, I'm going to spend time with this individual working on all three of these things every week, the head, the hands, and the heart. So we produced leaders in the churches simply by doing this. And we were able to do this within the context of our local church.
That's beautiful. I appreciated one of the lines you had in your book. The Great Commission should involve making disciples. Helping people to become obedient followers of Christ is the primary goal of a missionary. And to have the opportunity to step into that ministry and be coached, mentored, you said. You mentioned apprenticeships in the book. Giving people the opportunity to actually do that before we get on an airplane and go some other place and expect them to be able to do it. Well, I wonder, Paul, just as we begin to wind down, perhaps there are going to be some listeners who realize their church could do more to identify and help train mission workers. Supposing you had the opportunity to speak to them directly, what advice would you have for them, for those who want to take first steps toward this? What should we do first?
If you're interested in moving in this direction as an individual, I think the first step is you need to really connect with the leadership of your church and establish that mentoring, being discipled relationship. If you're talking about maybe the leadership of a church, moving forward with this, they really need to settle on a strategy of how to make this happen in their local church. And you've got to think through all of your programming, all of your events, everything you do to say, how do we align that with what we want to accomplish? I'm rather proud of the fact that I got about 70,000 miles out of my last tires. Well, it happened because I kept everything aligned. So much of what we do in church can take us in different directions, but if we align all of our efforts, our time, our money, our training, then you end up with what you want. And so you have to bring your whole church calendar into alignment with producing missionaries, where it probably is not going to happen very frequently.
It's a great analogy. We've got to be in alignment. Well, we know that we've just provided an introduction to some of these ideas, Paul. Scratched the surface, if you will. Are there resources that you would recommend for people who would like to learn more, think through it more carefully?
There actually is a study guide that goes along with this book, Senders, that you referenced. It basically just asks a whole bunch of questions that the leadership team of a church, be it a missions committee or the board or pastors, if you just answer the questions, you will come up with your strategy to make this happen. So I think there's a lot of good questions there. At least they're asking the right questions, I think. That would be of assistance to you if you want to really put pen to paper and start thinking through some of these issues. We also have another resource that we regularly update, and that is apaluo.org, which is a blog which basically just talks about these topics that we've been talking about today. And so there's multiple articles there over quite a few years, just giving ideas and resources and input and motivation on how to be a sending church. Apaluo just coming from that Greek word where in Acts chapter 13 they sent Paul and Barnabas.
Right. Spell that out for us once, Paul.
Apoluo.
Okay, we'll include all of this in the show notes so that if you would like to check out these resources that Paul has mentioned, you can do that by visiting the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. Paul, just personally then, if our listeners would like to follow up with you or follow you, reach out to you, how might they do that?
Feel free to contact me by email at pseger, S-E-G-E-R, at biblicalministries.org.
Very good. Well, I had a sense when I picked up your book, Paul, entitled Senders, the organization I serve with is Send International. There was an immediate resonance even by the title, but it went much beyond that. And so on behalf of our audience, I want to say a big thank you for spending this time with us today and for sharing some of your learning and wisdom with us.
It's been my joy. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks for listening to today's conversation. Remember, you can find the show notes on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com, including in this case the study guide for Paul's book, which is for church teams or committees who would like to process this information as a group. Also there, you'll find the filter on the homepage to find any podcast episodes that might be on a particular topic you'd like to learn about. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd sure appreciate your review on iTunes. And as our regular listeners already know, we're always glad to hear from you with suggestions for topics or interviews you'd like us to consider. That's all for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. And again, we invite you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.